for the Instagram post number 3 on Michael Carter's Ways of Knowing and Doing Through Writing. As you'll see, some of the writing studies, research, and publications can be rather dense, and it's typical to that field. And so sometimes it's best to review some of the information presented in the articles. And since we don't have class in person, going through some of the articles through the online video is something that might be useful for you. So I'm going to cover some main components from the article and kind of try to put it into layman's terms for you, because his article was pretty risky at the time, actually, and has actually framed a lot of interdisciplinary work and a lot of discussion about academic discourse communities. So one of the main points that Michael Carter makes is that, quote, the assumptions behind writing outside the disciplines are deeply ingrained in the very concept of the university, based on a particular understanding of the disciplines that has its roots in the transition to the modern American university in the last quarter of the 19th century. I'm sorry. This simply means that when we began to create more academic categories of exploration in the university, and then therefore various different colleges, that they often became kind of isolated islands of their own work, conversations, and research, writing, and so forth, to such an extent that many colleges, many academic discourse communities were not talking with each other, even though the work that they were doing was often very similar. The type of knowledge that they were trying to explore and produce had very similar frameworks. The types of writing structures and genre conventions and citation formats that they used were very, very similar. And so what he's trying to kind of argue is that there are some very somewhat broad disciplinary ways of writing, knowing, and communicating that have similar frameworks of knowledge. So many colleges that have somewhat of a STEM empirical research-based platform can speak to each other and kind of communicate with each other on a variety of various different topics, because the way they see the world, the way they research, the way they write about that research, the type of knowledge that they attempt to produce, and so forth, are very similar. And so you'll see this in a lot of STEM fields, right? But then you'll also see this in various departments that are similar, such as philosophy and communications, even anthropology, rhetoric and composition, English. Well, looking at the world somewhat different, with different goals about how they use theory and philosophy and history, they still do very many similar types of research, use very similar types of writing structures, privilege very similar types of research, and so forth. And so that's what he's trying to argue in this kind of quote here. Then Carter goes into this concept of a meta-genre. And so he draws this from the idea of genres, these being kind of like we talked about, artifacts of academic discourse communities, belief systems, goals, ways of knowing and doing through writing. Genres are kind of artifacts or vehicles of communication that are used to communicate the discourse community's particular, Sasha, everything's fine, areas of knowledge. And he draws from Miller and Bazerman and Russell, because they talk a lot about highlighting generic patterns of knowing, doing, and writing, both within and across academic disciplines. And so they use this term meta-genres. And so this simply just, instead of having these rather large categories of like writing or genres that are very specific to one unique field, rather they're trying to argue that between fields, similar genres are used. And I'm going to use somewhat of a more kind of profession-based example here, I think, to maybe try to highlight this in a way that might make sense. If you're in the medical field, everyone from the nursing assistants to the nurses, to the doctors, to the anesthesiologist, to the pharmacist, and so on and so forth. They will all utilize very similar Lexis. They will utilize very similar kinds of forms, such as patient reports, assessment reports, patient demographics, assessment plans, treatment plans, and so on and so forth. So while they're all in different, categories of professional discourse communities, they're all using a very similar Lexis, very similar communicative practices, and writing out those types of practices for communication between a wide range of individuals with varying levels of expertise. And so this is what Carter is trying to argue, is that there are main or major genres that are specific to disciplines and disciplinary writing, such as research proposals, conference proposals, presentations, book reviews, reports, pamphlets. And they often share very similar features between every single academic discourse community, but even more interesting, have very, very unique and similar features between disciplines that research or think about knowledge in a particular way. So some academic discourse communities will be very theory driven. So that again, it's going to be like your sociology, your psychology somewhat, but they do a mixed method, philosophy, rhetoric and composition, anthropology, those kinds of disciplines. Whereas other disciplines will be very empirical based. Your psych majors, right? Your pre-med, biology, chemistry, laboratory sciences, nursing, and so on and so forth. So the ways that they kind of present research through their writing of a proposal, writing a publication for a peer-reviewed article, presentations at conferences, book reviews, lab reports, or reports of research done in some kind of empirical setting, and so forth, will all share very, very similar features. And Carter wants us to consider that disciplines present the knowledge that they have, the goals that they're trying to accomplish, and the communication that they utilize through writing and research in somewhat very similar manners. And so rather than isolating each other, it's best to kind of see how they overlap and how various different academic and professional discourse communities can and do communicate, and what that might kind of provide for you as you're navigating your academic career, where you're asked to take these core courses such as English 3010, but also like, why are we being asked to take a biology